Few know that Pope Francis was a deep lover of animals. During his years in Vatican City, he formed a close friendship with a loyal dog who accompanied him in silence. And in the final moments before his passing, the reaction of that faithful companion moved all present to tears. It was Monday, April 21st, 2025. The Roman sky dawned covered by a thick fog, the kind that doesn't seem to bring storms, but silence. The air in Vatican City was different that morning. There was no wind, no bird song, and the bells of St. Peter's, although they rang, did so with a slowness that made the soul tremble, as if even the bronze knew that something sacred was about to end. Inside a modest room, hidden behind white curtains as peaceful as the dawn, lay Francis, not the Pope of speeches before multitudes, but the man, Jorge Mario, now fragile, with a pale face resting on a pillow that seemed made of mist. He breathed with difficulty. His fingers, intertwined on his chest, barely moved with each breath. Around him, doctors, cardinals, and nuns accompanied him in respectful silence. There were no words. He no longer needed them. And suddenly, in the midday haze, with a voice that sounded like an echo from another time, the Pope barely murmured, "Bring Lazarus." A whisper, a thread of voice that cut through the air like a knife through devotion. Glances were exchanged. A cardinal murmured, confused, "Lazarus?" An elderly nun, Domenica, brought her hand to her chest, understanding immediately. They weren't talking about a man. They were talking about a dog. Lazarus, the white, medium-sized dog, with a calm gaze and silent soul, who had accompanied the Pope during his last years like an old friend, like a loyal shadow that demanded nothing, only to be present. Since Francis had become gravely ill, Lazarus had been taken to Castel Gandolfo to live under the care of Sister Domenica. But it wasn't the same. Since then, the dog had stopped running, barely ate, and spent the nights lying next to an old cassock of the Pope's, sighing into the void like someone who misses what the soul cannot yet let go. The call was urgent. A car left the Vatican, crossed the cobbled streets of Rome, and reached the convent in the countryside. When Sister Domenica uttered his name, Lazarus raised his head for the first time in days. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He just sat up slowly, as if he knew the time had come. "He feels it, son," the nun said to the driver. "He felt it before we did." During the return trip, Lazarus didn't take his eyes off the road. The world outside continued with its noise, but inside the car a reverent calm reigned. The engine could barely be heard, as if it also knew that it was transporting something more than a dog. It was the last promise of one heart to another. Upon arriving at the Vatican, the guards made way in silence. The sisters bowed their heads. The dog walked alone through the stone corridors, without a leash, without haste. He seemed guided by an instinct older than reason. His steps echoed on the floor mosaics as if they were prayers. In front of the bedroom door, Lazarus stopped, not out of fear. He stopped like someone who knocks before entering a temple, a sign of respect. Sister Domenica could barely turn the doorknob, her fingers trembling. A guard nodded. The door opened. Inside, the evening light filtered through the curtains. Francis was still lying down, in silence, but not alone. The dog's eyes fixed on him. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He walked solemnly to the bed, sat next to the man who had taught him love with gestures, not words. He rested his muzzle on the sheet a few inches from the Pope's hand. They didn't touch. It wasn't necessary. In that tiny space, between fabric and flesh, something happened that no one said, but everyone felt. A reunion of souls. Lazarus didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Francis's face, as if in that stillness he sought to reconnect with something that went beyond the body. An inner breeze carried him far away, to the south of the world, to a dusty neighborhood in Buenos Aires, where it had all begun. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a boy with lively eyes and an innocent heart, who knew how to listen to the whisper of life in every corner of his neighborhood. In those days, the streets witnessed a primitive, sincere love, where faith was forged in everyday life and love was understood with the simplicity of gesture and word. Jorge was a humble child, born into a deeply Catholic and working-class family. His mother, a woman with calloused hands and a perpetually contained smile, worried about the livelihood and education of her children, but never repressed the generous spirit that sprang from him. From a young age, Jorge showed a special sensitivity towards everything that lived. While other children entertained themselves with noisy games, he would stop to observe how a pigeon perched on a windowsill, or how a stray dog sought refuge in a corner. Life in the neighborhood flowed at a leisurely pace, almost like an ancient melody that repeats itself from generation to generation. It was common to see little Jorge walking barefoot on the sidewalks, and as he passed, he noticed the animals that roamed helplessly. It wasn't unusual to hear him say softly, with that mixture of innocence and conviction that characterizes those who have faith in their soul, "Every animal carries the breath of God." The memory of that child became eternal in the image of him returning home with a new four-legged friend. Even though his mother would give him looks of slight disapproval, knowing that inside Jorge there was an overflowing compassionate spirit, he couldn't help it. With a shy laugh and that voice that mixed Spanish with the occasional English word he had learned at school, he would say, "Mom, he's my friend, and I'll take care of him." And so, between gentle scoldings and furtive caresses, the little dog would find refuge in the home. Once, he recalled between whispers of nostalgia, he arrived soaked, his fur covered in mud and scratches on his paws, rescued from an uncontrollable drain on a rainy afternoon. The scene was etched in the eyes of those around him, a daring child, willing to defy fate for a defenseless life. When the days of childhood mischief were over, fate led him to join the home of faith, in an orphanage where devotion and hope were the only currency. There, amidst the simplicity of the walls and the murmur of prayers, Jorge continued his custom of caring for animals. He was often seen under the shade of a large ombu tree, sharing his modest meal with several hungry dogs, or even a stray cat, to whom he spoke with tender fervor about the beauty of the world and the divine presence in every being. An elderly priest who had witnessed those days recounted in a slow voice and a look full of respect, "I remember little Jorge sitting for hours with the animals." It was no coincidence that, in his prayers, he always included the critters and the furry ones. For to him, every creature was a reflection of the Creator. He would say, "Every animal carries the breath of God," and his words had an echo that resonated in the hearts of those who heard him. While other children were distracted by video games or quick chats, Jorge developed an intimate connection with nature that seemed to defy the barriers of time. Those moments of calm, in the twilight of his childhood, grew within him like the roots of a robust, deep, and life-filled tree. It was said that even in adulthood, when life led him to occupy the highest positions in the church, that humility and affection for animals never faded. His love was as discreet as the breeze that caresses a wheat field at sunset, but as intense as the fire of a bonfire on a cold night. The years passed, and the boy from Buenos Aires transformed into a man who carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, without ever losing that tender and compassionate essence. Although the appearance of power and authority hung from his words and gestures, in the silence of his interior remained the purity of the child who used to share his bread with a stray dog. No one saw him change when, in private meetings and moments of recollection, his gaze was lost in the memory of those afternoons under the tree, when the world was summed up in a simple thank you to the Creator. His passage through the ecclesiastical world was as leisurely as the beat of a heart that doesn't get carried away by haste. And in every action one could notice that echo of childhood. The memories mingled with his present. In every prayer, in every encounter with the faithful, one perceived the unwavering presence of a child who had always known that love is not measured in empty words, but in sincere gestures. And indeed, when he became a bishop, and later the supreme pastor, his actions continued to speak in a silent but powerful language. In one of those moments of recollection in the Vatican, just before assuming the responsibilities of the magisterium, An old friend from the orphanage visited him privately. They sat in a small room lit by the golden light of sunset, and between memories and knowing silences, the friend confessed, "I always knew, Jorge, that the love you had for animals would mark you for something great. Your affection, your way of seeing the world, is a gift to all of us." Jorge smiled, letting the weight of memory fade a little in that intimate conversation. He responded with the simplicity of someone who has lived in communion with the mysteries of life. It's just that, in the end, we are all part of the same great miracle, don't you think? Life, with its slow cadence and its relentless tenderness, marked him with the imprint of that childhood full of love. And although the settings had changed, from the cobblestones of a humble neighborhood to the mystical corridors of the Vatican, the essence remained intact. A love that does not surrender, that manifests itself in the simple, in the everyday, and, above all, in the certainty that every creature, however insignificant it may seem, is a bearer of divinity. It was late summer 2017. The Vatican rested under a solemn, almost eternal calm. The olive leaves whispered in the wind as if they were praying. That afternoon, Francis went out for a walk alone, as he sometimes did, seeking air, perhaps seeking a moment with himself. He had no close escorts, only the murmur of his steps on the gravel paths, and the distant song of a late cicada that refused to bid farewell to the heat. That's when it happened. From the north side, just where the iron fence meets the ancient wall, a dog entered. It wasn't big nor small. With light fur, black eyes, and a calm gait, the animal crossed with total serenity, as if that garden had always been his. The guards saw him immediately. One stepped forward with a firm gesture, raising his hand in warning. "Your Holiness, an animal has entered." Francis, who was observing a bird's nest on the low branch of an olive tree, wasn't startled. He just slowly turned his head, looked at the dog, and with a barely visible smile raised his hand. "Leave him." The soldiers looked at each other, confused. In the Vatican, animals couldn't roam freely. There were norms, there were rules, but that gesture from the Pope was enough. The dog didn't bark. He didn't run. He walked straight towards him, and upon reaching his feet, lay down. He put his head on his front paws and looked at him with that kind of look that only animals have when they recognize something that humans have already forgotten, the silent connection of souls. Francis bent down with effort. The years were already weighing on his knees. He stroked the dog's back slowly, as if tracing a memory. He said nothing for a few seconds. Then he murmured, almost to himself, "Your name will be Lazarus." One of the assistants, who was observing the scene from afar, heard him. Later, he would recount that the Pope explained his decision with these words: "He arrived just when I most needed to remember that there is still comfort. Like that other Lazarus, he came to give me back hope." From that day on, Lazarus became part of the Vatican landscape. Although dogs weren't officially allowed, no one dared contradict the Holy Father. The guards learned to live with that four-legged shadow that followed him through the corridors. The sisters who attended his residence prepared a corner for him with a warm blanket next to his desk. And the Pope himself, when he went out onto the balcony or sat reading in the garden, always had Lazarus close by. Never tied up, never restrained, simply near like an extension of his breath. One day, one of his assistants, a young Mexican priest who had recently arrived at the Vatican, dared to ask him, "Your Holiness, what is it about this dog that gives you so much peace?" Francis looked at him, and with a slow voice, almost as if speaking from a corner of his childhood, said, "He doesn't speak, he doesn't ask, he doesn't demand, he just is. And sometimes, son, that's enough to heal." Sometimes, during private audiences, Lazarus would discreetly slip into the room. He would sit next to the Pope's chair without making a sound. Some visitors were surprised, others were touched. There were those who saw irreverence in that gesture, but Francis never explained or justified his presence. Whoever understood it, fine. Whoever didn't, also fine. Lazarus was there because he belonged, because life, with all its mysteries, had given him a place. No one knew where that dog had come from. No one claimed him. No one looked for him. But he stayed. And that, in Francis's eyes, was more than enough. As the months passed, Lazarus's presence ceased to be a novelty for those who worked in the Vatican. He didn't appear in photos, nor did he accompany the Pope on his public trips, but his existence was felt in every corner of the Apostolic Palace. He was a living part of the silence, a presence that didn't seek glances or praise, but that everyone recognized as one recognizes a prayer said in a low voice. Every morning, before the sun rose completely, when St. Peter's Square was just beginning to awaken, Francis was already awake. He would sit at his desk with the Bible open in front of him and with a cup of tea that he sometimes forgot to drink. At his feet, Lazarus, curled up like a ball of peace, barely breathing, with his ears alert in case his owner moved the chair or sighed differently. He didn't bark, he didn't ask, he just was. After noon, when the bells struck 12, Francis would go to the inner garden, that corner where time seemed to move more slowly. Under an old olive tree that gave generous shade, he would sit on a stone bench, and there, without saying a word, he would caress Lazarus's back, slowly, with fingers like leaves rustling in the wind. The dog would close his eyes. The Pope, too. No one interrupted them. One afternoon, Sister Domenica, who observed them from a distance, remarked in passing, "They seem to pray without speaking." And yes, that's what it was. A silent, shared prayer, woven with glances and pauses. Francis didn't need to repeat sermons. He had already said much to the world. Now, his messages were gestures, his words were caresses, and his teachings, silences. There were more difficult days. One cold December morning, Francis woke up with a fever. Nothing serious, the doctors said. Just tiredness, age, the body speaking softly. He was ordered to rest. He wouldn't go out to the garden or celebrate Mass. 3 days, maybe 4, nothing more. But Lazarus knew before anyone else. That dawn, instead of going to his corner of the desk, he lay down at the foot of the Pope's bed. He didn't move. He didn't eat. He didn't drink water. He just watched over him, with his eyes open all night, as if he could ward off the pain with the simple force of his love. One of the doctors asked permission to let him stay. Francis, with a hoarse voice, barely said, "If he leaves, I won't sleep either." And so it was. Lazarus didn't leave his side for a single minute. When Francis breathed more heavily, he would raise his ears. When the fever subsided, he allowed himself to close his eyes a little, but always there, as if his soul had been born only for that, to accompany. Sister Domenica, seeing him so faithful, said one night while petting him, "You are more than a dog. You are a 4-legged miracle." Francis, from the bed, smiled weakly. "He just needs to look at me to know how I am. If I breathe differently, he feels it. It's as if we were connected from the inside." That bond couldn't be explained. It had no name or logic. It was deeper than obedience, purer than any promise. It was love, good love, the kind that doesn't demand, the kind that doesn't judge. Love of the kind that doesn't need words because it recognizes itself in the sigh of the other. And so the days went by, slowly, with that calmness that beautiful endings have. Francis didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice was soft, like the rustling of a dry leaf. He spoke to God in silence, and he spoke to Lazarus without saying anything. The Vatican continued its rhythm, with meetings, reports, pilgrims, and letters. But in that small corner where a pope and a dog shared time, the world seemed to be suspended. It was as if there was no noise or haste there. There were only the two of them, two souls aging together, one human, the other animal, but both equally sacred. The body, like an old tree, sometimes begins to say goodbye without words. The Vatican doctors knew that well. And although Francis never complained, his signs were clear. He no longer had the strength to walk to the garden. His voice became a thread in the afternoons, and the silences were longer than ever. It was then that a difficult decision was made. On medical recommendation, and seeking to keep the room clean, quiet, free of hair and possible allergens, the doctors suggested that Lazarus be temporarily transferred to Castel Gandolfo. The Pope didn't argue. He just nodded, very slowly, while gently stroking the head of the dog sleeping at his feet. But his gaze was something else. It was one of those that aren't forgotten. The day of his departure, Lazarus offered no resistance. They wrapped him in a gray blanket and carried him in their arms. Francis watched him until the last second, as one bids farewell to a part of himself. When the door closed, his breathing slowed a little. He didn't say anything. There was no need. At the convent of Castel Gandolfo, where Sister Domenica received him, Lazarus simply stopped being a dog. He no longer barked. He no longer played. He no longer wagged his tail. He lay down next to a white cassock, old and somewhat tattered, and there he stayed. For days. He didn't eat well. He only drank water occasionally. At night, he howled softly, as if calling someone, as if asking without a voice, "Where are you?" Domenica tried to cheer him up. She took him out to the patio, took him for walks through the gardens filled with lavender and rosemary. But he, still, always looked in the same direction, south, towards where Rome hid behind the hills. He stayed there, motionless, as if waiting to see someone arrive, or as if waiting for a sign to be able to return. One afternoon, the sister knelt beside him, hugged him gently and said softly, "I know, son. You miss him too." And he, without turning, sighed. A long sigh, the kind that hurts without making a sound. Days passed. One, then another. At the Vatican, Francis's health was worsening. His voice could barely be heard. The doctors spoke in hushed tones. The prayers were more constant. And then, one early morning, just before dawn, the phone rang in the convent. Sister Domenica answered. On the other end, a calm but firm voice uttered only 5 words. "His Holiness has called for him." There was no need to say more. She understood. Without even changing her habit, she wrapped Lazarus in his usual blanket, held him in her arms, and they got into the car. During the journey, there were no tears. There was no barking, only the sound of the engine, the wind entering through the half-open window, and the solemn silence of 2 beings who knew, each in their own way, that the end of a road was approaching. Lazarus wasn't trembling. He wasn't afraid. He was awake, but at peace. His black eyes didn't move from the road, as if he knew the route, as if his heart told him he was going to his place. "He knows," whispered the sister. "He knows he's going home." Upon arriving at the Vatican, the atmosphere was different. The bells weren't ringing, but everything vibrated differently. The guards made way without speaking. Some nuns crossed themselves as he passed. It was as if a sacred figure was crossing the threshold. Lazarus walked through the marble corridors with a firm step, neither slow nor fast. Each footstep was like a note in a melody that only he could hear. In front of the Pope's bedroom door, he stopped. He didn't bark. He didn't scratch the wood. He just waited, as one asks permission. One of the guards looked at him. He nodded, and the door opened slowly. Inside, the room was bathed in soft white light, like an eternal dawn. Francis lay peacefully, with his eyes closed, his hands on his chest, and the serene expression of someone who has already said everything he had to say. Lazarus entered. He's approached without making a sound. He looked at the face of the man he had loved unconditionally and lay down beside him, very close, his muzzle brushing the sheet. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just breathed slowly. The room was bathed in a very dim white light, as if heaven itself had stopped right there, filtering through the curtains with the respect of someone who doesn't want to interrupt. Outside, St. Peter's Square remained calm, still unaware of what was about to happen. Inside, everything was waiting. Everything was silent. Lazarus remained at the foot of the bed, his ears slightly drooping, his gaze fixed on the face of the man he had loved so much. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just was, and his mere presence spoke more than 1,000 speeches. Francis was barely breathing. His chest rose and fell so slightly that anyone might think he was already gone. But no, not yet. Between life and death there is a sacred space, an invisible threshold where souls look at each other, say their last words. And in that space, Lazarus was there, as a witness. Then something happened. A finger. The index finger of the Pope's right hand, resting on the white sheet, moved a little. It wasn't a strong gesture, not even noticeable to everyone. But Lazarus noticed it. He slowly turned his head and, with the gentleness that only those who love unconditionally have, brought his muzzle to the edge of the blanket. He didn't bite it. He didn't pull it. He just touched it barely with his nose, as if that touch were a caress, a farewell, I'm here. One of the priests in the room, a man with a white beard and tired eyes, couldn't hold back his tears. He brought his hands to his face. Another, younger, lowered his head and began to pray softly, almost without moving his lips. A nurse left the room without saying anything. Her shoulders were shaking. In the corner, next to a wooden shelf, Sister Domenica clenched the rosary tightly in her fingers. She knew the moment had come. She felt it in the air, in her skin, in the way time itself seemed to stop. It was as if the whole world had held its breath. And then, without a sound, without announcement, Francis's soul was released. There was no heavy sigh, no last words, just a slight loosening of the fingers, a peace that spread through the room like a veil of tenderness. The bells of the basilica began to ring at that moment, not by programming but by intuition, as if they also knew. Ding, dong, ding, a soft, constant sound, like a prayer made of bronze. But inside, the silence weighed more. Lazarus didn't move. He didn't howl. He didn't cry. He just closed his eyes and stayed there, his body touching the cold marble and his muzzle brushing the sheet. His posture was that of a guardian, that of someone who doesn't leave their loved one even after the end. The people in the room remained still for a long time. No one dared to break that moment, because it wasn't just a death. It was a goodbye that transcended the physical. It was the departure of a soul that had taught the world to love the least of these, to respect life in all its forms. And in the midst of that goodbye, Lazarus was still there. Not as a pet, not as a symbol, but as what he was, a friend, the most faithful, the last. Minutes passed, the light changed, the bells continued to ring, and finally, when the Pope's body was covered with the white sheet, Lazarus raised his head, not as a reaction, but as an act of honor. He looked at the covered face one last time, and then, very slowly, lay down even closer, his side against the edge of the mattress. Sister Domenica approached. She knelt beside him and whispered with tears in her eyes, "It's over, son. He's resting now." But Lazarus didn't move. After everything was silent, those in charge of the final ritual arrived. They washed the body with delicacy, as one bathes a sleeping child. They dressed him in the white habit he had chosen years ago, simple, without embroidery, with a small wooden crucifix on his chest, a gift from an African girl who once hugged him with eyes full of hope. They prepared the coffin with white flowers. They lowered him with respect. But Lazarus didn't move, not when they opened the door, nor when the procession began its slow journey through the Vatican corridors. He simply watched, with those deep, dark, sad, but peaceful eyes. He didn't bark. He didn't howl. He didn't make a fuss. He just followed his friend with his gaze until he disappeared behind the last door. Someone tried to lift him in their arms to take him to the garden. "Come on, son. There's nothing more to see." But he didn't react. He didn't bite. He didn't defend himself. He just lowered his head like someone who accepts something they can't change, but doesn't want to either. That night, they took him to the back patio of the Apostolic Palace. There, where he and Francis used to sit under the olive tree, they gave him a blanket, fresh water, food he didn't touch. Sister Domenica stayed with him for a while. She spoke softly to him. She caressed him as one caresses a mourner. "If you don't leave, neither will I," she said in a broken voice. And he stayed, like a living statue, looking at the sky. After midnight, something happened. A white dove, the kind not seen in Rome when it's cold, appeared at the window of the room where Lazarus was sleeping. It perched without fear. It looked inside, and it stayed there for a while. A young novice, who had gone out to get some air in the hallway, saw it. She was carrying her rosary and immediately crossed herself. "It's a sign from the Holy Father," she murmured. "He is already where he should be." And no one argued, no one questioned, because in those days, faith walked on the surface, and every detail felt like a divine whisper. After the funeral, when the cameras were turned off, the pilgrims returned to their countries, and the prayers became softer. Lazarus was still there, under the same olive tree, in the same posture, as if waiting for his friend to come out that door again and say, as always, in a soft voice, "Come on, son, it's time to walk." But that voice didn't return. And yet, Lazarus didn't leave. Little by little, those who worked in the Vatican began to change the way they referred to him. He was no longer the Pope's dog, nor His Holiness's pet. They began to call him with reverence, the guardian of the last breath. And so it remained, as a living legend, as a symbol of a fidelity that doesn't require words, of a love so pure that not even death could interrupt it. People who saw him in the garden stopped in silence. Some cried, others prayed. Many just watched him, as if his mere presence was enough to remind them that faith is not always in temples nor in sacred books, but also in the silent heart of those who love unconditionally. And Lazarus, he was still there, looking at the sky, waiting, perhaps, for one more sign, or perhaps knowing that he had already received it. Because sometimes all it takes to understand true love is to sit in silence, next to the one who knew how to give you everything without asking for anything in return. This true story about Pope Francis and his faithful companion Lazarus not only moves us to tears, but also leaves us with a profoundly human and spiritual teaching. In a world where everything happens quickly and we often forget the essential, this narrative reminds us of the power of silent love, the loyalty that doesn't need words, and the tenderness that transcends species. Lazarus wasn't just a dog. He was the guardian of the soul of a man who dedicated his life to serving with humility and compassion. Pope Francis, with his simplicity and closeness, showed us that greatness is measured in the smallest gestures, petting an animal, sharing silence, looking with mercy. His life is a testament to love without borders, to faith lived in every detail. From the depths of our hearts, we offer a prayer for his eternal rest. May the Lord receive him into his infinite peace, and may his legacy continue to inspire the world. Thank you, Holy Father, for teaching us that even the last breath can be an act of love. May God grant him eternal glory. Amen.